Okay, we are here live at the virtual home of Princeton Public Library tonight for our event on pandemic diaries and writing during the pandemic. And I have with me two guests who have both written pandemic diaries, and I will introduce them in just a moment. My name is Janie Herman. I am the public programming librarian at Princeton Public Library, and it's my pleasure to be here tonight. We have lots of people online, and we were just discussing, this is going to be a somewhat informal conversation about writing during the pandemic and different ways that people have used words and writing as an outlet during this time. We have two people who, as I said, have published books recently about their experiences, and we're going to hear from them. But then anybody else who's on here as an attendee, we're going to encourage you to join us on screen momentarily. Maybe you've been writing. We would love to hear your own experiences, or you can put comments in, and of course there'll be a question and answer. So you can put things in the question and answer box so that we can make this be interactive and everything else. So let me go over here and let me introduce our two panelists to the crowd. First of all, we have Ethan Casey. And Ethan and I, we go back over 10 years, and I'm just so happy to have him here with us. He's out in Seattle, I'm here in Princeton, New Jersey, and we're connecting again in this way. Ethan has spoken several times at the Princeton Public Library when he's been on the East Coast. And so it's so lovely to have him here with me again. He's an old friend. Or a longtime friend. Neither of us are old.
We're not old.
No, we're not old. So Ethan is a publisher and veteran international journalist who has written books of topical travel about Pakistan and Haiti, as well as a long driving trip around the USA in 2012. Once international travel becomes feasible again, he hopes to complete a book on local people in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, combating poaching of endangered southern white rhino and other wildlife. He lives in Seattle, and he is here with David Howell, who is the author of The Descent into Happiness, a bicycling journey over the Cascades and Rockies and across the plains, published by Blue Ear Books. He is a professor in the humanities department at the Milwaukee School of Engineering. He teaches courses in creative thinking, ethics, composition, and research methods. His MFA in poetry is from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and an individual interdisciplinary PhD from Washington State University. When he's not teaching, reading, or writing, he's riding one of his bikes. And his bike does have a very central part of this book as well that he just published. So both Dave and Ethan's books are published by Blue Ear Books at blueearbooks.com. And we're going to start out, and I'm going to have Ethan start out because I know that Ethan's diary, he started in the very, very early days of the pandemic. And I think before anybody knew that this was going to be something that was happening for so long. So Ethan, what was the point that you wanted to do that?
The point, in a way,
I'm sorry.
The point was to do something, right? So we all, it was a little bit like after 9/11, a lot of people did in some cases, extraordinary creative or logistical things that they wouldn't even have thought about doing until the attacks on the World Trade Center sort of galvanized a lot of people into action. I remember that time well. And I remember that this time a year ago, or a year and a month ago now, felt similar to me. So beginning to write a diary was something that I could do. I couldn't claim that it would be useful to anybody, but it was something that I can do. I'm a writer. I'm in the business of paying attention. Journalists pay attention for a living, and I've paid attention in Pakistan. I've paid attention in Haiti and South Africa and other places around the world. And suddenly, not just the United States generally, but Seattle specifically was in the eye of the storm. Right where I was the front line for the United States of the pandemic. And we had to get our heads around that really abruptly. And when I say we, I mean specifically we in Seattle. There's a short passage from my diary that I'll read sometime to sort of convey the feeling that we had early in the pandemic about the disconnect between people in Seattle and people elsewhere before elsewhere got taken over as well. But a friend of mine, a local friend, Dennis Ray, egged me on. he urged me. He said, "Ethan, you gotta write a diary." And of course, you could retort, "Well, why don't you write a diary?" But I didn't have that retort ready at hand, and I took him up on the challenge. So an important point was that Seattle was on the front lines. I felt strongly motivated to document whatever I could locally and as locally as possible, including things like trips to the grocery store. And that was, we've all had many trips to the grocery store. And then in an early time, it was especially weird. What's it like? You know, we've all, yeah. And to also to document what it felt like at that time, because there are things, impressions and feelings, as well as specific information that's available to you in the moment if you pay attention and document it in the moment, that it's not gonna be accessible to you a year later. Partly as a matter of perspective, and partly because the information just sort of goes away and becomes part of a vastly changed context. So to me, that's the value of keeping a diary. And I'm going to say the following, and try to say it in a spirit of modesty. But I was, which is not always easy for me, but I was a little bit motivated by the role model of George Orwell, who was kind of trapped in Britain during World War II. He wasn't able to travel because of the war, and he made the best possible use that he could make of the fact that he wasn't able to go anywhere except England, and in many cases stuck at home. And if you read his 4 volumes, specifically volumes 2 and 3 of his collected essays, journalism, and letters, there's some really extraordinary documentation of history on the fly in those books. I don't claim to be George Orwell or in his league, but I think any of us can do something like what he was doing in that time.
That's wonderful. I think you're so right. That's the purpose of writing a journal or a diary, is histories in the making. And none of us, I think we all expected this to be, 2 weeks or 30 days or 3 months, and that it wouldn't be over a year later that we would all be sitting here. Now, David, I understand your journal started a little bit later. You weren't there at the forefront in March. Ethan, I was watching Ethan post his through Twitter the links to his journals, and he was right there, and it was really interesting because Seattle was kind of even ahead of the East Coast where I am, so it was kind of like a precursor to what was going to happen here. So you didn't start your diary till June. So what was your impetus to start your diary in June?
Well, I applied for and received a faculty development grant from the university where I teach at, so I could create a textbook for my ethics class. And I tried to write in such a way that the material is very accessible to my students. I don't know if you've read ethics textbooks; they're kind of dry, very theoretical. I really enjoy reading those books, if I have to admit. But the plan was I was going to ride my bike with my son from Calgary, British Columbia to the Mexican border along the Great Divide. So it was going to be this epic adventure. And while having this epic adventure with my son, who would have recently graduated from college, this would be his big graduation gift, I would write this book on ethics, or establishing a moral paradigm in such a way that you engage in right conduct. And what does that mean? These big questions that we talk about in my class. But then the pandemic hit. You couldn't go into Canada. We were not being encouraged to travel at all. So I couldn't have that big epic cycling experience. My son decided to stay in Portland. I was going to stay in Milwaukee. And I thought, well, how can I still make this happen? Because I received a grant to write a book. And at the same time, like everyone else, I think I was struggling with the pandemic. How was I supposed to respond to this situation? There was a lot of protesting for Black Lives Matters in the city of Milwaukee. for good reason, because Milwaukee is a heavily segregated city. There was a lot of protesting. Meanwhile, our governor for the state of Wisconsin was encouraging everyone to stay at home. Don't leave your house. So what was I supposed to do? What would be the right course of action? So what I decided to do was to ride my bike to local parks where I could sit outside and try to make sense of all of the information being consumed over the media. I don't know if the rest of you had this experience, but I couldn't put my smartphone down. I had this steady scroll going on between CNN and NPR and Slate. We were watching Lester Holt every night on the news. But it was just too much, right? You'd watch a 30-minute NBC news bit, and they were shoveling in so much material because so much was happening on a daily basis. And I'm a firm believer in not being overwhelmed by content. As a writer, I am paralyzed if I consume too much material. So I had to find that mental space and that physical space so that I could write something that my students could appreciate on a topic that seemed all the more relevant given the pandemic, right? How should we behave in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of social unrest, in the middle of a presidential race that was nothing but a political theater? I had to make sense of all of that and do it in such a way that I could narrate it to my students. So it seemed like a viable opportunity. If one can behave appropriately in a pandemic, then one can behave appropriately.
Yeah. And in your case, well, what did appropriately for you specifically end up meaning?
Yeah, so it meant engaging in self-actualization. Once again, reminding myself that I'm a hardcore introvert. I really enjoy solitude. So playing to my strengths and socially distancing to the extreme. So I am an avid cyclist. I would ride my bike to a park. I would sit still for an hour, and I would ruminate, and I would try to make sense of everything I was processing, and then take out my laptop and write an entry. So I really enjoy cycling just because of the way it makes me think. For those of you who have a medium like that, I like bicycle touring, where you're sitting in the saddle for 9 hours a day, just because of what it does to your brain. And you know, the larger the problem, I think the more time and space we need to resolve problems. And certainly our culture, our country was forced with a lot of problems in the summer of 2020. So I was trying to recreate that experience, but to do it domestically, to do it within a quick bike ride from my house, so that I wouldn't be putting myself or others at risk, which was a challenge because I you know, like everyone else, I got stir crazy after a while. I'm still sitting here in the basement of my house, learning how to not be irresponsible with my behavior in terms of, you know, being overly engaged in social drama. So,
Yeah.
so leaning hard into introversion, spending time alone, it was the right thing to do in terms of what my governor was asking of the citizens of the state of Wisconsin. And it was just the right thing for me to do personally. And certainly using the computer, the laptop, to document and journal this experience was critical so that I could explain to myself and to my students how one navigated one of the most challenging times in one's existence.
I think, thanks, Dave. If I could pick up, Janie,
Yep.
I think one thing that both our books sort of exemplify is the compulsion and the need that we all had to pay attention locally. and to behave and live locally. For me, that was an adjustment. I've spent most of my adult life traveling globally and making a point of going as far afield as I possibly could in many cases. I lived in Asia for most of the 90s. And so it was surprisingly undifficult, surprisingly easy for me to adjust to being happy to be, quote unquote, stuck in Seattle. And Seattle's a very nice place. If you have to be stuck somewhere, I recommend being stuck in Seattle. But that local aspect, I think, is very important. And when we all later on, when we all really start making sense of this period, I think the kind of local experience and local attention everywhere is going to be part of the story. I found that, in my diary, there was a blend, right? So there was the blend between paying attention locally, the compulsion that we all had to pay attention to national and global events at the same time, and that in itself could be draining, especially in that early period. I would read a couple of dozen news articles every morning, starting at like 5:30 in the morning, and then by 10 o'clock I'm wiped out, and I couldn't quite understand why I'm so wiped out. Well, it's because I've been, taking in this avalanche of news. And then the third thing that I think we've all also experienced is, and I think maybe this comes through more in my book than in Dave's, but you could correct me if I'm remembering wrong, Dave. Staying in touch with family and friends, right? We all have gotten, especially in those early times, we got emails from family and friends. Hey, this is what's happening here. This is what's happening there. And we were on the phone to people, and then we started Zooming with everybody. So I think those were the three dimensions in which I was and still am living.
Yeah. So I just did a share screen so that I wanted to make sure everybody on here was aware of your books and where they were and what they were about, to see the covers again. And so I wanted to say, I think, what to me has been really interesting about this last year is the convergence both of the pandemic with the social unrest, and we've touched upon that. Yeah. And I think how intense it has been, and I think the feeling of exhaustion, and I think a lot of people have found solace in words and writing. Ethan, did you say you wanted to share something with us from your writing?
I'd be happy to, if it's a good time. I just going through I've been rereading the early diaries. My book isn't published yet, so I'm in the late stages of preparing it for publication in book form. So I've been reading the early entries. Here's one it's March 7th, so keep in mind how early that was.
March 7th on the East Coast, we weren't even closed down yet.
Right, yeah.
It wasn't, here we know it's March 13th. It was Friday the 13th that my son came home from school, that we closed the library. I mean, it's very clear in all our minds when that happened here in Princeton. So.
Yeah. I went to a concert on the night of March 7th, and that felt weird already at that point. And I went on March 8th, I went on a 14-mile hike on Bainbridge Island with several friends. But that was the last such thing any of us did, at least in groups. So here's a short paragraph, March 7th. Yesterday, I spoke to my brother in DC and my father in Colorado Springs. Both are intelligent and thoughtful men, and I'm not alienated from my family either personally or politically, which I gratefully acknowledge is more than many Americans can say. But both my brother and my father, left me with a sense that they were strangely disconnected or remote from what to me feels like a truly alarming burgeoning public health crisis. I think part of the disconnect was the difference between being in Seattle right now and being elsewhere around the USA. Although there are now known cases in Colorado and in Montgomery County, Maryland, near DC. And later yesterday, we learned that 2 people had died in Florida. My brother's probably here listening, he might not appreciate this part. My brother asserted wishfully, I thought, that the coronavirus will abate, quote unquote. And he tried to reassure me with the example of how China seems to have put a lid on its outbreak. which was not exactly reassuring given that what it took in China, if it even really was effective, which some of the experts I'm reading are calling into question, was the shutting down of entire cities much larger than Seattle by an authoritarian national government. So, so that's that. There's
Yeah.
one. Yeah. Here's another, I mean, sort of in a similar vein. This is April 14th, I believe. Yesterday, and this is in the vein of paying attention to what's going on outside, you know, at the same time as you're trying to live and pay attention locally. Yesterday, some events of note took place out in the wider world. Trump claimed that, quote, when somebody is president of the United States, the authority is total, which everyone knows is not true, and which two groups of states, anchored by New York in the Northeast and California on the West Coast, gave the lie to by announcing coordinated plans based on the authority of state governors to reopen their economies as and when they see fit. I'm glad I live in one of those states. That gubernatorial authority is explicitly specified by the United States Constitution, as many pointed out yesterday, but at this point, that seems almost a moot point. The daily number of coronavirus deaths seems to be plateauing, maybe even declining a little, even in New York. But the greater crisis is no longer the virus itself, but the economic, political, and moral bankruptcy of American life that it has exposed for the world to see. So
Yeah. Yeah, those early days they were certainly confusing. And Dave, did you want to read something from yours, or did you want? You said some screen share, like, because I think they both are such different books,
Yeah.
dealing with
So,
the same problem. Yeah.
yeah, no, I can read. This is the third entry, like the third day I was writing, and I'll just read from this passage. On my bike ride to the park, I passed a local college where, in the parking lot, they provided drive-through COVID-19 testing. I'm struggling to understand how National Guard troops dressed in full hazmat suits can conduct COVID testing while 7 miles down the road, kids play baseball. This isn't good. I spent a lot of time thinking about what is good, probably because I teach an ethics class. My job is to teach students what good is, but to help them find it on their own. The students write essays about what they learn, assignments I am required to grade. I determine if the students write what is good or not. What's harder is getting the students to want to write good essays, to see the value in articulating, delving into, and defending an articulation of applied goodness. And this chapter goes on from there because, you know, to find out what does it mean to be good in such difficult, arduous times. It's not just knowing how to act, but knowing and how to react to the information we are receiving on a daily basis. and that's why I really value these passages that Ethan is reading, because it does bring back just a flood of memory of what was going on back then. I mean, before, I mean, I have, as an educator, I've had the opportunity to receive both my vaccines already. That itself was an amazing experience. Just the communal experience of going to a hospital and receiving those inoculations, especially after such a long time of unknowing and learning how to live with all of those unknowns. It's something that I hope I never forget.
Yeah.
Time passes and we do forget. And again, and that's, as you've been saying, Dave, that's the value of diaries. It's been interesting to reread my own diary now a year plus later and realize you get, I don't say that, you know, I feel normal now. It's normal is not the right word, but I've adjusted to the change, right?
Right.
And the change is a longer term one, and we all have to live in that longer term changed context. At the time, it was not long term. It was very, very immediate.
Yeah, I kind of myself wish I had kept some kind of a a diary. I mean, maybe my tweets are a diary. I don't know. I'm a prolific tweeter, or Twitter user. But the only time in my life that I actually was very good about journaling and keeping a diary was during we adopted our son from Russia 17 years ago this summer, 16 years ago this summer. And I did that, and that's something actually that I'm really glad I did, because there's so much of that process that I forgot. It was a very long and arduous process, and I was doing it, I thought, for my son, so he would know what happened. But as it turns out now, it was as much for me so that I can always reflect on what that process meant and why and what we were going through at the time. So we have a question here that I think maybe both of you can discuss a little bit. It's a really great question. It says, they want you to discuss the difference between being attentive and observant to events around you, which is what journalists do, and being observant to your emotions and reactions, which is what is the purpose of a diary or journal. And how are the processes similar and how are they different? Now, I know, Ethan, you're much more of the journalist maybe than David, but I mean, I think there is a big difference between just being attentive and observant to events and recording events in a journalistic style and writing a diary or journal, which is much more personal.
Yeah, it is a great question. We tend to think of journalism as just the facts man, right? That it is, in America we use the term objective, or we used to use that word, and I kind of object to that word. I don't think it is appropriate in terms of human experience, much less journalism. I had the good fortune to spend a lot of my early journalistic career overseas in Asia and then later in Britain, and I kind of imbibed an international or British ethos of journalism, which allows more for the personal point of view. So I think it's as a journalist, it's important to acknowledge that your own point of view is not omniscient, and that's part of what the British tradition allows for. But what the question is also getting at is, what's the extent of the validity of your own feelings, your own personal response or emotional response to events. That is a more difficult thing to address, because if let's say I'm in a war zone and I see people being killed, which I haven't seen people be killed, but I've been in violent situations. I have an emotional response to that, but it's not my job to tell the world about my emotional response to other people's suffering as a journalist. I think something like keeping a diary like the ones that we're talking about is a little bit different, because part of what you are documenting is your own internal response. And I tried to do that in my journal, and I think that's an appropriate and necessary thing to do about this particular kind of event, if that makes sense. I could go on at more length about that, but I think it's, but the danger is navel gazing, and you don't want it to turn into that. You don't want it to be like, look at me and all the emotions I'm having. Right. Somebody on Twitter early in the pandemic tweeted something. Somebody I really admire as a writer, who is an Asian woman. This gets to identity politics, right? And I'm a white man, and this Asian woman writer whom I admire tweeted, Black and brown people are suffering and white people are writing personal essays about all the baking they're doing at home or something like that, right? It was kind of a dismissive thing. First of all, there's a lot that one could talk about such a tweet, but I didn't like that. I didn't appreciate that tweet because I didn't feel that was what I was doing at the time or what I wanted to be doing. I did try to take it to heart, and I also think there's some justice in the critique that any of us, whatever our ethnic background, writing about our domestic comforts or domestic situation is a dangerous thing to do, especially if our domestic situation is a comfortable and safe one, especially in a time like this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that goes back to, I don't know where the saying started, but it's been passed around a lot now, is that people kept saying, well, we're all in the same boat. And no, we weren't all in the same boat. We might have been all on the same journey someplace, but some people were definitely in an ocean liner and other people in a leaky canoe during this time. You know, the size of the ship mattered, and there were certainly a lot of people falling through the cracks and still are. And it is somewhat along racial and color lines in this country, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And it's hard to reconcile with.
And I think it's for someone with a privileged and comfortable situation like mine, there's a lot of responsibility. If you're going to write at all, you need to write mindfully of the larger situation in society. Yeah, otherwise, don't write. Right?
Yeah. Dave, did you want to try and answer that question?
Well, I think one thing I really value about daily journaling is that it is a daily experience, and it does force you to become aware of everything you're consuming. I mean, I remember watching the news and seeing a young woman holding up a sign that read, "Silence is violence," and I had to process that information because I was trying to create serenity. I thought, well, if I can find peace of mind, and if that can be at the core of my existence, then whatever I do will be appropriate. So hence going to parks and trying to embrace whatever nature I could experience. So what was it like for this young woman holding this sign in downtown Chicago? What was her meaning for silence? And I knew I was writing. I knew that I would eventually publish my writing, and I wouldn't, and this was my way, like Ethan said earlier on, this was my way of exercising voice. It's the best way I have found in this existence to exercise voice. I mean, I've been journaling since I was 20 years old on a daily basis. I don't know how I would live without having a journal, to be quite honest. And to speak to something you said earlier, you know, I can dip back into, you know, journals I wrote a decade ago, 20 years ago, and realize I was a different person then. But at the same time, I was still asking a lot of the same questions I ask now. So there's change, but there's also a lack of change. Then all of a sudden, everything around you is changing. You know, my daughter catches COVID, and we didn't know what that meant. My father-in-law, my father were both hospitalized, and they're in their 80s and 90s, and we thought we were going to lose them. Everything that you take for granted is certainly no longer solid, and it was just so much to process. I could not have imagined coming through this pandemic without having the journal as a tool for just reflection, for perspective, for documentation. There are so many reasons to engage in this activity. I don't understand why more people don't engage in it. I mean, it's a vehicle of artistic expression. It does so many things on so many levels.
Yeah, I find that you know, Dave's last point or question about, you know, don't understand why other people don't do it, or not everybody does it. I have my version of the same question, which is I'm just compelled to write. I'm what I am as a writer, right? People ask me, why did you become a writer? And it's like saying, why were you born? It's just, I can't even answer the question. And I've had to teach myself over many years that most people aren't writers in the sense that I think of myself as one. That's okay. They're whatever they are. They're something else. But the other thing that comes to mind from what we all have different degrees and different ways in which we document our experience too. So I think journaling in the way that Dave does, or writing, diaries as I've done is maybe not something everybody will or should do. Um, but that said, I know that there are many, many people who have either they've already written whatever, their own journals, or they could write something, or they will write something, or they could be interviewed in oral history fashion. And there is an enormous amount of documentation and anthologizing that will need to be done of the vast diversity of human experience through this time. And I'm kind of eager to be part of that, to do some anthologizing and publishing of other people's stories.
Well, and you would think that, I know that now in Princeton we're doing, and I think there's probably a lot of these around the country, I think we're doing oral histories, and oral histories is another way of collecting these experiences. And there's a website called Voices of Princeton. And so we are, collecting those. And I think a lot of people are more comfortable maybe with talking through what they're feeling as opposed to writing. Maybe I'm one of those people. I also think that a lot of people just put a lot of their thoughts out there on social media, and maybe that's their way of journaling in a way. It's interesting to see how much of this we'll be able to do. I mean, I think collective experiences of communities are going to be so different. I see that do we have some hands up here? Oh, hang on a minute now. We have questions that have come in. We have a question from Zahid, who wants to know, to Ethan, you mentioned Orwell as a role model or someone to emulate, and wondering if it was the unconscious choice influenced by all the crazy theories about the China virus, as Trump would call it. Or after all, Churchill could have been your role model as someone to follow in terms of writing a diary.
Well, indeed. Yeah, I won't go on at any length about that, actually. It's a good question. I just think Orwell was a really good journalist and a really excellent payer of attention. And he had his hobby horses, and he had his blind spots, and he had, in his novels, or classic important novels, of course. But if my own feeling about Orwell is that he's more important as an observer, and as an essayist and journalist, than as a novelist. So again, I go back to, and Churchill certainly. But the other thing about Churchill is it was all about him. With Churchill, it was like he wrote 4 volumes called The Second World War, and the whole gist of those 4 long volumes was, here's how I won the Second World War. So we talk about putting yourself at the center of the story. Churchill certainly did that. Orwell had a healthy ego, but generally his writing was not about himself. It was about the things and people and stories that he was paying attention to.
Okay, we have Michael here on screen. He had his hand up. Michael, can you hear us? You need to unmute.
Okay, I think I just have.
Okay, hi, Michael. Welcome to the screen. So did you have an experience to share? Are you a diary keeper, or did you have a question?
Oh, I have a confession to make, which is mainly the reason I'm here is so I could hang out with my old friend Ethan and co-author Ethan. I'm a journalist, and I wanted to respond to what Ethan said about objectivity as being mistakenly thought to be what journalism is about. And I guess I want to say that in the past year, or even longer than that, I've come more and more to believe as I've gotten older that your feelings about a subject that you're writing about as a journalist are more and more important, because it's your feelings about what you observe and are reporting that really shape the way that you present it to other people. And one of my examples is that a couple years ago, I was writing a lot of stories about abuse in Catholic institutions. And I have learned that, I have some personal experience with that because it's happened to friends. I went to a seminary and that happened. And that gave me the impetus to write about it in a clearer way, and also I think a more effective way, something that would reach the readers more. I've spent some of the past year writing another form, which is partly journalism and partly journaling. And interesting enough, of course, journalism and journaling come from the same word. But I've been writing a memoir since I've now turned 70 years old. And having done that, I feel more and more that there are other people whose biographies should be written. And I'm even compelled to try to write some of those. But the way I wrote the memoir was to use my journalism training and my career as a journalist in a strange way, and write my memoir as a series of newspaper articles about what happened to me in my life.
Yeah.
So the
Well, that's
third
an interesting format.
perspective on the first person experience. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating, actually. Henry Adams comes to mind, who wrote, he wrote his own, Henry Adams, the great grandson of John Adams, who was a distinguished author in his own right. His famous book is The Education of Henry Adams. And one really striking thing about it is it's written all in the third person. He writes about himself as if he were someone else. So he's documenting, he's navel gazing, so to speak, but he's documenting, and what he's documenting is this important history that he lived through, and so that's why it's a classic book.
It's an interesting experience to do that, to write about yourself as if you're in the third person. And I didn't really understand why I was doing that. I just thought it was fun, might be a fun thing to do.
Yeah.
But now that I'm done with it, I think I have more of an understanding of why.
That's great.
That your own life and your own experiences are, in a sense, newsworthy, at least for a small circle of people around you.
The question for anything any of us writes is who's gonna read it, and well, there is so much writing that happens, so much that's written. There's a sense in which human experience is vastly over documented, and yet probably everything that's actually written is less than 1% of everything that happens. So
yeah. Well, here's what I just had something that came to mind, just based upon what Michael said, and thank you for joining us. We're gonna get back, because I think also David wanted to share his screen with us and do some other things, but I think we write these things, and you just said to your small circle, but I think we never know what's going to happen in the future. And last night we had a program, there's a book that just came out called Band of Sisters that talks about the Smith College Relief Unit that went to the front line of World War I, right at the front line of France to Germany. And it was this group of small women from Smith College, and they wrote copious amounts of letters and diaries and journals. And they all went into the Smith College archive. And it wasn't until someone came across one little newspaper article about this and then called up and realized that nothing has been written about this. And so this, it's a fictionalized account, but it's really well done. And she spent hours, she said, there's thousands of documents there written about this, and that based upon her book. And this is now 100 years later coming to light, really what these women did at the front. It's a really amazing, amazing story. And you go on. So who knows, like 100 years from now, if someone's going to look back on the pandemic, and if these things find their way into a college archive or find their way, who knows where, and someone gets a hold of that, and then that becomes a part of that's going to become a part of something in the future. And I think that's what we have to realize is the archival things of this. Right. And, I think these women who were at the front in World War I writing their journals and diaries never thought that it would be 100 years later turned into this, what's now a New York Times bestseller, and really bringing light to what happened 100 years ago in this very little tiny segment of World War I that nobody paid attention to. And it's now coming out. And so I think that's the importance of doing what all of you are doing. So we're going to go back to David, because David, do you want to share your screen now? Thank you for joining us, Michael.
Yeah, actually, I don't have to share my screen. What I would like to do, though, is talk about the value in book as a genre. This is something Ethan and I have talked about numerous times, is the need to read books, the need to write books, because there is room, yes? If you're going to write something 200 to 300 pages, it really requires you to do a deeper dive. I mean, I tried to make sense of this pandemic through social media, and I think just because of the chunks information, I couldn't make sense of it. I couldn't write what I was trying to experience through social media. So that's why I think I was grateful to have a journal, and then eventually putting it into book format to think about, how to begin this thing, how to end this thing. But for the sake of book, if that makes sense. I mean, I love books. I think so many people probably in this call, my house, my office at work is nothing but books. I look at them and they are a chronicle of what I have learned over my 56 years. So I'm really grateful, I know, to have read Ethan's book, for example, because it really is a chronicle, a chronology of what has happened to Ethan Casey over the course of this pandemic. And there is a depth to it and a rhythm to it that I think has to unfold over the span of hundreds of pages.
I think when you're picking up on that, I think when you jump off the cliff and opt to write something like what I did, and Dave in a different way, it's a leap of faith. You're supposing that there's going to be not necessarily an endpoint, but there's going to be some point at which you can maybe stop and say, okay, here's a book, or here's the completion of this project. I couldn't have kept up the pace of it much longer than I did. It was pretty tiring to be paying that close of attention and to be putting it into words, feeling responsibility to do it every 2 or 3 days most of the time. And part of the value of it in book form gets to what you were saying, Janie, which is that it's documentation, and there are ways that there are perspectives on what we're living through now that we can't know, but people 100 years from now will know.
Yeah.
Somebody 100 years from now might pick up my book and go, wow, that's what people were going through.
Yeah, and again, you never know. I guess that really just came clear to me. There were those women at the front, and they never would know that this would be what was discovered. To them, they were just writing letters to their family, journaling what they were going through. They weren't thinking of this for posterity, and yet it was.
Well, so the difference is that I was writing for publication in the immediate sense, and that I was putting it online, putting my diary online each time I wrote it. And I am a writer, so I have enough of an ego that I want people I don't know to read what I write. And in a sense, those women's letters are better and purer kind of documentation because they were written only for their family and friends.
Right.
Yeah.
We had another question here. We actually have 2 more questions, but I'll do this one first. This is a shorter one. Doug wants to know what might be good tools to not get overwhelmed by too much content. So, how do you not get overwhelmed by the content that you're experiencing?
Dave?
I think a lot of it is just only using one application at a time. So if I'm using Microsoft Word, I have to exercise the discipline not to have Google open, Outlook open, having all of that other stuff open. Not just so I can focus on what it is that I'm writing, but just because there's so much material coming at me. How can I make sense of what I'm trying to think about if I'm continually being interrupted by all of the media that I try to plug into? So, and also to simply unplug. I mean, my exercise last summer, excuse me, was to go to these parks to sit outdoors, to look for a type of media that was not digital. I watched birds and squirrels and watched clouds cross the sky. Toward the end of the summer, after ritualizing this behavior, I could actually watch a bank of clouds go from one edge of the sky to the other, and that was learned behavior. And that helped me survive the pandemic because it helped me get that bigger perspective. Things were not so immediate. Things were not chunked into smaller and smaller bits. I was striving to see the grand, the nature. I mean, for me, nature is not God's creation, but God's manifestation, and that distinction is important to me. So, if I am outdoors, then I am in the presence of God, and that proved to be very helpful and soothing in those arduous days of the summer of 2020.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We all. I had an intelligent thought to add, but I can't remember it.
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of us, we always have a million tabs open on our computers, and yet what it does have to come down to sometimes is close down those tabs and just focus, or just take those few moments. And I think too many of us aren't doing any kind of mindfulness. And I think more and more in this time, we need mindfulness. We need to be present, because our brains, I mean, there's that whole theory that right now that a lot of people, there's like an underlying stress because we're in the pandemic. Even if we don't feel like we're being stressed that day, we're still under stress because there is that constant threat to our survival
At every moment.
at every moment.
I will add one thing that came to mind. Ursula Le Guin is one of my very favorite writers.
I love Ursula.
Yeah, she's awesome. In one of her late essays, she said, "Reading is an act, you do it," and that's always stuck with me. And this addresses Doug's question, and it's a different way of saying what Dave said. I think that you have to do whatever you're going to do actively. You have to take charge of your own consumption of media. You have, if you're being bombarded with too much media, do something like what Dave did and make sure you're not bombarded with too much.
Yeah.
It is up to you. You can control it.
Yeah, and I've heard like a lot of people, like you said that you can't imagine living without writing, that you're a writer, and I'm a reader. I mean, besides being a librarian, I am a reader, and I have always been a reader. And yet during this pandemic, there was a point, I mean, I had to read some stuff for work because my job, but I found it very hard to focus on reading for pleasure, which was what I do. I'm a reader. And there was about 2 or 3 months there in the middle of that and I've had a lot of people who are readers tell me that they couldn't focus long enough to read a book, that their mind was too distracted. And so for me, what I ended up doing was making the habit of just like, I actually took some social media breaks in there and like just signed off. And I just started with, okay, I love short stories. I'm going to read myself a short story today. And now I'm back into the swing of reading long novels and being able to read. But I had to make that conscious decision and retrain myself to shut my brain off long enough from everything to get back to reading. And, I think this pandemic has affected so many people in different ways. And maybe there's people out there who are writers who, I've had some people who say that I can't write right now. I can't do this. I just can't. It seems so overwhelming. Everything seems,
Yeah, that's right.
And it wasn't, it was the pandemic, and it was the election, and it was the unrest and the big things that are happening in our world right now. It's a lot.
Well, so for me, it was really what really helped. First of all, what you just said about reading, it totally rings true to me. I had the same experience. There were periods when I couldn't read a novel, couldn't sit down and read a book. But for me as a writer, the diary format really helped. On any given day, I could sit down and I have to write about this and this today, and it doesn't have to be long. It can be 500 words. Maybe it should be only 500 words. So write those 500 words. I ended up writing a total of 96,000 words between March and October. Wow. But I tried to keep it short. I could have written much more.
Right.
But the compulsion to write frequently but at short length really helped. And
Yeah.
that helped me keep from feeling overwhelmed. I don't have to understand it all. I don't have to know everything. I can just say this.
Well,
Yeah.
and I was trained to write poetry before I ever started writing nonfiction. And one thing I learned early on with poetry is, the more concentrated the information, the shorter the poem should be. And I felt that way writing prose this last summer. So much of the information was so deeply concentrated that I couldn't say too much. I had to try to minimize it as much as possible, because it just felt like the right thing to do. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but I couldn't just continually let my fingers go nuts on the keyboard. And maybe that's because what we experienced in this pandemic has just required so much reflective thought.
Yeah.
That to find those few answers to help us get through and navigate these arduous times, it really is consolidated. It's very concentrated. It's not orange juice, it's orange juice concentrate.
Yeah.
That's the metaphor I use with my students,
Yeah.
And one day a student brought a can of orange juice concentrate to class and gave everyone a spoon, and we all tasted that. And that is a metaphor that I have thought about during this pandemic. Life has been concentrated this year. So that's why it makes sense to me that in these books that Ethan and I have been working on, the chapters are very brief, but there's just a wealth of material in the pages.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I can't wait to have a chance to read both of them. I mean, I know they're both on pre-order, and I'm looking forward to it. I want to get to, we're coming up on the top of the hour, and I see that I believe, and I hope I'm pronouncing it right, Zahid has some questions in there. They look very specific towards Ethan, and maybe Ethan wants to try to type answers out to him because they're very interesting, or maybe you guys want to, I think it looks like there's a lot that you guys might want to talk about. We do have a really good question here also. I mean, not that Zahid's aren't. One question I want to finish with maybe, because we're coming up on the hour, is how does one deal with the confidentiality if one is journaling about personal experiences? In this pandemic, suffering has been painful for all. For example, to describe a young man's COVID hospitalization tells a story of much depth and is a story in itself. So do you worry about liability in what you're doing?
Well, I gave a copy of the manuscript to each person who appears in the manuscript, and they all had the ability to tell me if they wanted to be in the narrative or not. Fortunately, they all said yes, that was okay. So I was lucky in that regard.
Okay.
Yeah. But this is a great question. I mean, there are many things going on in that question. Part of my specific answer in this context is that I didn't write about things that were confidential in this book, or in other books, I hope, that are confidential to other people. So a young man's COVID hospitalization is an excellent example. I didn't write about that. And I haven't been in the position of being a journalist, being asked to write about that kind of thing. Many journalists have been. That is an absolutely compelling and important story that needs to be told, and yet the journalist has ethical and moral and political concerns in how to write. You don't want to put the other person in danger. You don't want to embarrass the other person, the person that you're writing about, unnecessarily. There's a difference between a person who's powerful and a person who's powerless, someone you're writing about. There's a difference between public figures and ordinary people. I'm thinking of a youngish friend of mine, who's a nurse in Southern California. He was a nursing student at Texas Christian University when I was spending a lot of time there in recent years, and a military veteran. Now he's a nurse in Southern California. And the last time I was in touch with him a couple of months ago, he told me that 8 of his own patients had died of COVID. Not that they had contracted COVID, but 8 had died of COVID. And as a writer, as a journalist, and as a publisher, I'm greedy to hear more of my friend's story. And one of these days, I'd like to sit down with him and say, you know, maybe there's a book there. But I have an obligation to be cognizant of everything that he's been living through. Even if he hasn't suffered himself with COVID, he's been witnessing suffering and death on a daily basis for months. There will be many books about that kind of experience and that kind of work, and there should be, there need to be. I hope that I can maybe publish a book about my friend's experience. We'll see.
Yeah. Actually, here's one last question that just came in from about how you selected the cover of your book, Ethan, because it is a very unique cover.
Yeah.
So how did you select the cover? Did you draw that, or is that an artist, a friend of yours that did it?
Yes, I'm delighted to give a plug. The artist is Dave's daughter, Kate Howell. Caitlin Howell, she's a very talented artist, also doing graphic design now, and she's going to be working with us more extensively in Bluer Books with other new titles we have coming out. She did the covers of both of Dave's books and the cover of mine.
Yeah. I mean, Dave's book is self-explanatory, The Bike by a Park Bench. We got that. But yours is a little bit more conceptualized.
Yeah, and I'll I don't know if Kate is here or not, but I won't put her on the spot by asking her to talk about it. But the idea was, first of all, the curve of there is a curve there, and it represents a snapshot of the curve of COVID in Seattle. And I can't speak at the moment to what specific period it covers, but as you see those peaks and valleys, those are, you know, from real life. And all the little people represent all the people that have been, you know, it's sort of a maelstrom of human beings, you know, sort of in various postures, in various shapes and sizes. And so there's a sense of the maelstrom that we all live through. And then specifically, I'll just say that there's one particular little figure. There's a little guy tapping on a laptop, and that's supposed to be me.
No, I have to bring it up now because we're talking about it. So, hang on, I'm going to just share my screen for a second. Okay, I got it.
So the funny thing about that little guy that's me is that I actually do most of my first drafts, at least, on with a pen on a yellow line pad. So, but
where are you on here? You're
go to books and oh, there yeah, that's me.
Yeah,
yeah, in the middle top, just east of the O. So go down a little bit.
Okay.
O and before.
Fourth row down. There you go.
Oh, I see, right in there. Okay.
So
okay,
that's me.
Okay.
I hope the cover is eye-catching. I hope it's also a little bit mystical and hard to understand, because that's fine with me.
Yeah, they're both very, very catchy covers. They are wonderful. So again, let's just wrap up. So we have Ethan Casey, who was published in the Before Time, which will be, or is getting ready to publish. It'll be coming out soon, and it's on Bluer Books, ready for pre-order. And this is it here. And then we have David's book coming out tomorrow. Is it?
Oh, it's already out. It's already out.
It's been out.
Yeah, and you can get it. It's on Amazon, as well as you can buy it through that button on Bluer Books. You can buy it on Amazon and
Lulu.com.
Yeah. The Serenity Experiment by David Howell, searching for personal peace in a world that won't slow down. And I think we all need a little bit of serenity right now, and we also need a little bit of reflection in journal writing. And I hope this event tonight maybe will encourage some people to get out and start writing their own journals. I mean, this is not over yet, and it's not too late to reflect on what's happened in the past year, and maybe even doing some broader strokes about what you've experienced. And I was saying we have a poetry writing group at the library, and I know some of the poets have been capturing what they've experienced through poetry. my husband's a musician. He wrote a song about, well, we lost my mother-in-law to COVID, and he wrote a song about what he was going through at that time. And so whatever personal way that you can share what you're feeling and experiment, whatever your art is, maybe you want to do a painting. I think it is important for us all to capture what we've been through this past year as a shared experience. And I want to thank both Ethan and David for spending some time talking about what they've done. And I encourage you to support Blue Ear Books, an independent publisher. It's great. And I think that's all I need to say yet. Oh, we had another question pop in. Let's just say, you guys can just put, oh, I don't know. I think we have, so, I mean, the questions can be seen by the panelists and they can type you some answers. Oh, well, no, this was not a question. Just somebody saying, thank you for an excellent presentation. Well, that's a very good way to end this. I agree. This was an excellent session. We will be putting this up on the library's YouTube channel if you want to go back and watch it again, or if you want to share it with other friends who weren't able to be here live with us tonight to watch this conversation unfold. And I guess that's all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we will see you soon.